What a pleasant morning. The sun is shining, the birds are tweeting, I've got a cup of tea and some biscuits. Nothing could ruin this. Except for the announcement of a significant political event that will allow liars and manipulators to spew vicious bile that will result in significant harm and discrimination to people of minority groups in a desperate attempt to grab power. That would actually ruin my day. Anyway, let's check the news. So there is this little thing happening next week, I'm not sure if you've seen, but it's going to be International Kissing Day. Oh, and the general election is due to happen in the United Kingdom on the 4th of July. You know, nothing significant or anything. It will be the first general election since 2019, during which everyone hid inside their homes for several months. We watched an iceberg sink a premiership, and the UK Treasury tried to get some of that sweet, sweet Discord nitro. And now we're here in 2024, how time flies when you're having fun. So, considering you've clicked on this video with its fancy thumbnail and title, you probably have an interest in queer rights. Or, you know, a queer. And you might be thinking to yourself important questions like, who should I vote for? Where does each party stand on LGBT rights? What wine do I pair with my mushroom risotto? And I'm here to answer all of those questions. White wine goes with mushroom risotto, something like a Riesling or a Muscat? Mwah. Now, I can't cover every party in the UK because as of early 2024, there were over 300 political parties registered, plus all the independent candidates, and only 13 of them are actually in the UK Parliament. Many of the parties listed are small, single-issue or regional parties that, to be honest, haven't actually developed a complete set of policies beyond a few outlines around their core base. So it'd be pretty redundant to evaluate the policies of, say, the Yorkshire Party, who in the last general election received a respectable 30,000 votes, and compare them to the Conservative government, who got 13 million votes and has been in power since 2010. So, I'm sorry that I can't go over the LGBT policies of the likes of Mervyn Kernow, the Psychedelic Future Party, or the Northern Independence Party. Although, in the case of that last one, they're pretty alright. If you don't want to watch the rest of the video, go vote for them. I'll instead be covering the UK's 10 most prominent political parties, based on their presence in the national psyche, current power and influence in the UK Parliament, as well as in devolved governments, and the likelihood they'll be able to influence LGBT rights by, you know, winning seats. And when I say the UK, I mean the UK, so I hope you're looking forward to learning about the politics in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'm going to be doing a lot of talking about transgender rights and transgender people for two main reasons. One, trans people are currently being used as a political football, and two, seeing how each party treats trans people acts as a very good barometer for how they would treat other queer people in general and what they would try to get away with if they could. But before all that, let's learn about how UK politics works, and I promise that I'll finish before you can say the word anti-disestablishmentarianism. So, the UK Parliament is split into two components, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, which is the important one for us because it's the only one that we as normal people can have some sort of influence over. The UK Parliament is also known as Westminster, after the area of London it's located in, and I'll be using them interchangeably throughout the video just to keep you on your toes. Members of the House of Commons, or MPs, are directly voted for by the public in either a general election where one is called, or in a by-election should a MP resign. Or, you know, die. They represent a constituency, an area of roughly 50,000 people. Elections are run with the first-past-the-post system, where the person who gets the most votes wins, regardless of whether it was actually a majority or not. Running for Parliament is actually quite simple. Fill in a form, send it to the acting returning officer of your constituency by the deadline, along with a £500 deposit, and that's it. Get busy telling everyone how great you are. Then, on election night, you get to stand around in a big hall feeling important with your little ribbon on as the votes are counted. And then you go up on stage to find out if you've won or not. You even can wear a silly costume if you want. If you lose, you become a name on a Wikipedia page for nerds like me to look at in the future. And if you've won, congratulations! Here is your ability to push your opinion into national policy, your flat in London covered with the assistance of UK taxpayers, excellent future job prospects working for banks, and a measly £90,000 a year salary. And to top it all off, you get your £500 deposit back. Most MPs are members of a political party, which they generally run for in an election, whom they generally line their opinions with, and whom they generally vote with in Parliament. You can be an independent MP by choice or by force, in case you do something to get thrown out of your previous party, but you won't have access to the perks that being in a political party does have, like easier recognition and identifiability, money to campaign and promote yourself, and the opportunity to be in the government. If you get to Parliament and then you start to regret the party you joined, you can defect and join another. Although, if you've got to Parliament by joining a particular party and then don't think that party is right, I would question whether your beliefs are sincere or you're just easily convinced. The party with the most MPs forms the government, assuming you get a majority of 326 MPs, and the party with the second most MPs forms the shadow government. Despite the cool name, the shadow government effectively allows the opposition party to act as a mirror of the real government, showing how they would govern and respond to various issues going on in the country. Traditionally, this is usually by doing the opposite for what the government is doing, but as we will see later, this isn't always the case. But wait, I hear you cry. Aren't coalitions a thing? Well, yes, but actually no. Coalitions are possible, and it would probably be healthier for the country if there were more coalitions. But the nature of having two dominant parties throughout history, as well as the first-past-the-post voting system that supports the duopoly, means that coalitions aren't really a thing in the UK. There's a reason why the 2010 to 2015 Conservative Liberal Democrats coalition is simply known as the Coalition TM, because it's the only one to occur outside of periods of crisis, namely World War I and World War II. Every other government has been majority-based, and even some of them were minority-based, so opposed to true coalition governments the UK political establishment is. Whilst parties have broad themes and opinions on certain issues, factions and individual MPs often have opinions that go against party lines and can rebel against their party's instructions. To understand modern politics, you need to understand old politics. So here's a brief political view of the UK. A classical view of the British political spectrum would be something like this. On the right, we have the Conservative Party, a mainstay of British politics since the 1600s. In the beginning, they were known as the Tory Party, and became known as the Conservatives in the mid-1800s, and have kept the name since. Both Tory and Conservative are interchangeable, but calling someone a Tory has a much more accusatory and negative tone to it than calling someone a conservative. The counterweight on the left side of politics has changed a lot throughout the past 400 years. It started with the Whigs for about 200 years, from the 1600s to the 1800s. During this time, we had Britain's greatest Prime Minister. Hit the elder. Then the Whig Party collapsed in the mid-1800s, and the Liberal Party took its position. And during this time, we had Britain's greatest Prime Minister. The Liberals continued to be a political force until after World War I, when their support began to decline quickly. The Liberal Party does continue well into the 20th century, and they still technically exist today. But A, they aren't at all politically relevant, and B, they have very much been superseded by the splinter group, the Liberal Democrats. So, what happened to the left wing of politics after World War I? A relatively new and low-key party called Labour began to grow rapidly in working-class areas. In 1923, Labour formed its first government with the support of the Liberal Party, which lasted about 10 months, until the parties fell out and a new election was called. The Conservatives won that election, supported in part by a document which claimed that the Communist Party of Britain was to start seditious activities, which negatively affected Labour's perception and prospects. That document was forged and was published by the Daily Mail, so this is your regular reminder to never support any newspaper in the United Kingdom ever. Labour did recover over the 30s and 40s and has been in and out of power since, although the party has undergone several significant shifts and changes in its 100-year history. The concept of a centre party, or a party between the established left and right parties, didn't exist until after World War I, when the recently ousted Liberal Party were sort of just shunted into the role. As I said earlier, they stuck around until about the 1980s, when the Social Democratic Party and the splinter group of the Liberals formed the Liberal Democrats, and immediately proved more successful than the old Liberal Party. The Liberal Democrats have been around ever since, although their prominence has varied over time. So you may think, based on this classical view, that British politics looks like this. You have the Conservatives on the right, Labour on the left, the Lib Dems in the middle, and then some smaller parties around them filling various political niches for voters who feel passionate about a particular subject. This, as a view of current British politics, is wrong. It's very, very wrong. The Conservatives have absorbed and incorporated so many different political ideologies that each one is competing against the others to try and seize control of the party. Labour, over its history, has taken very significant shifts and turns in its policies, to the point where saying it's a left-wing party is not genuine, and all the other parties have shifted around and overlap with everybody else to the point where discerning between them can be difficult. You could read 10 manifestos to help you tell the difference, but you won't. They're really, really long, and they're really, really boring. And that's why I'm here. I've read them, so you don't have to. Over 500 pages of political babble and spin to understand what these parties think of queer people and what they want to do, so I can give you a short politics rundown ready for voting day. I see you shiver with anticipation. Let's find out who the UK's most queer-friendly party is, and by extension, the most queer-unfriendly. I've covered most of the Conservatives' history in the introduction, so I'm not going to rattle through 400 years of politics here. For our purposes, you only really need to know from 2010 onwards. The Conservatives have just returned to power, with David Cameron in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. Cameron lasted until 2016, when he was replaced by Theresa May. May was replaced by Boris Johnson in 2019, who was replaced by Michael Gove in 2021, who was replaced by Liz Truss in 2022, who was replaced by Rishi Sunak in 2022, and who is, for now, Prime Minister. Now, one of those is wrong, and I'm not going to tell you which one because it will be on the quiz at the end of the video. The Conservatives are, well, conservative. It's right there. Although a defined ideology beyond that is difficult to define, in part due to the actions of the Conservatives themselves. Almost all parties have at least some range in their policies to try and pull in as many voters as possible. The Tories have gone beyond the usual extent of that, though. To keep their significance and monopoly of influence on the right side of the political spectrum, they have placated more extreme elements, adjusting their policies to prevent rival parties from forming and instead integrating them into the Tories themselves. To see this, we only need to look at Brexit. Look, I'll be quick. People might not know or remember, but the likes of the BNP, the literal British nationalist far-right party, used to have a significant presence in politics. In the 2010 general election, they actually had the 5th highest number of votes, although got no seats. Voters and members alike realised that the BNP was never going to win an election as the BNP, so they defected to a more moderate, less fascist-y party called UKIP. Fast forward to 2015, another general election, and UKIP finishes with the 3rd highest votes, although once again no seats. UKIP campaigned on a platform of leaving the European Union, as well as some general right-wing conservatism. The Tories felt threatened by the evident success and appeal of UKIP and introduced the Brexit referendum in their election manifesto, folding UKIP supporters back into the Conservative Party. So, in 5 short years, people who had previously supported the British National Party are now integrated into the government. As you might expect, integrating far-right wing elements into your party has had some very significant effects on policies such as, I don't know, LGBT rights in the UK. Although the Conservatives have always been very slow at accepting them throughout their history, supporting traditional values and other phrases that don't mean anything. Leader Rishi Sunak, who is already pretty right-wing, has had to try and placate the more extreme members of the party, currently through the method of railing against queer people and transgender people. He has appointed notable anti-trans people to cabinet positions, including Kemi Badenoch, a woman who has been absent for votes on gay marriage, who said that trans women weren't women, and whom Sunak had made previously the Minister for Women and Equalities. Rishi Sunak has also introduced a bill that would remove sex education for children under the years of 10 years old, which includes bans on gender ideology. The most high-profile incident of the Conservatives interfering with queer rights was when the Scottish Parliament passed a law that would allow transgender people to change their gender by self-identification. This bill is going to be referred to quite a lot in this video, so here's what it is and what it was made to achieve. The Gender Recognition Reform Act of 2022 was approved by the Scottish Parliament that streamlined the Gender Recognition Act 2004. The framework of how transgender people in the UK can legally change their gender. The Scottish bill did this by lowering the age at which a person could legally change their gender from 18 to 16. It removed the requirement of having a gender dysphoria diagnosis to apply for a gender recognition certificate, and it dropped the living in your preferred gender time span from 2 years to 6 months. It effectively allowed trans people to change their gender legally earlier, easier, harder, better, faster, stronger. Sorry, I became French for a moment then. The Conservative government blocked it from royal assent, the final step before legislation becomes law, where essentially the monarch goes, yeah, sure, and something enters law. Kemi Badenoch, the Women, Minorities and Equality Minister at the time, rationalised the government's decision by saying that the Scottish documents were of a lower integrity because they would be less rigorous than the documents in England and Wales, which are done through the Gender Recognition Act and thus would be more susceptible to fraudulent applications. This is in spite of the fact that the Scottish Bill and consultations around the bill had been in works for several years, and it is one of the most debated bills in Scottish parliamentary history, and passed through the Scottish Parliament with a supermajority of over 66% of MSPs in favour. It's quite evident the Conservative Party has a sort of flat contempt for queer people beyond just normal obstruction. They have been very reluctant to do anything that could be at all perceived as supporting queer people. I'm about to talk about something quite heavy and upsetting. If you don't feel comfortable hearing about it, skip forward about a minute or so into the video. One incident in particular occurred during Prime Minister's questions on the 7th of February when Sunak and Starmer were doing their usual jabs at each other, and Rishi Sunak decided to say this.
Defining a woman! Although in fairness, that was only 99% of a U-turn.
Within a vacuum, this is just transphobic language, which is obviously bad, but we all know they do this, right? It's nothing new. Adding context, Sunak made this comment when the mother of Brianna Ghey, a transgender girl who had been brutally murdered a few weeks before, was due to appear in the House of Commons. It was remarkably tone-deaf and offensive, and even afterwards Sunak refused to back down or offer an apology or a statement of regret or anything, and instead used it as a simple connecting point to continue bashing Starmer. It extends beyond Sunak as well. I've already mentioned Kemi Badenoch and her statements, but Foreign Secretary, and perhaps the most ironically named politician since John Honest, James Cleverly, suggested that queer football fans should compromise and show respect when attending the FIFA Men's World Cup in 2022. This was, as you remember, the World Cup in Qatar, a country in which homosexuality can be punishable by death. When people justifiably complained, Cleverly asked for understanding and respect for the country that, to repeat, can use the death sentence against queer people, and that was using the World Cup to sportswash its awful human rights record. I'm aware I've just said some quite heavy comments, so let's make fun of the Conservatives to lighten the mood. Most parties in the UK have an LGBT+ or queer group within themselves to be a voice for queer opinions within the party itself. The Conservatives are no different, but their group it's something else. Firstly, they used to be called LGBT Tory, and I love a good pun and all, but just because you have the opportunity to make a pun doesn't mean you should take the opportunity to make a pun. Secondly, they're really whingy about the fact no one likes them, and I would say yes, no one likes them because they're aligned with a party but doesn't like or support queer people. Thirdly, their Twitter handle, I'm not going to call it X, Musk dead names his daughter, I'm dead naming his website, is LGBT cons, which is great. Fourthly, and also the one that disproportionately bugs me for how little it matters, is they have really cringy merch. They give out these buttons to their members. On surface value, this means nothing. It's just a rainbow flag and the phrase oxymoron implying something. It only works when you know it's about queer people being in the Tory party, implying that being queer and being a Tory are opposites or are incompatible. And yeah, a bit. You've seen what they say. But there's no way to know that from the button itself. So instead of an oxymoron, LGBT conservatives are just regular morons. They have this t-shirt that says the problem with pride is that you run out of someone else's gin, as well as just being a bit pretentious. It's also a reference to Margaret Thatcher's "the problem with socialism is that you run out of everybody else's money" quote. Given Thatcher's previous stances and turns towards queer people, I'm not sure trying to do a fun, quirky ode to a woman who introduced Section 28 and stood by as AIDS and HIV left people dying is a good look. And perhaps the strangest one they sell, for money, this baby's bib that has the phrase "I kissed a Tory and I liked it" printed on it. And all I will say is that you can pay with money and it will cost you £16. The Conservatives can't let the culture war against queer people die, and are determined to have more anti-LGBT policies in their manifesto. They are committed to not allowing gender identity to be taught in schools. Section 28, we are so back. They want to implement the CAS review in full. You know, that document about trans healthcare that was so scientifically flimsy that I could use it to make balloon animals. They want to change the Equality Act. Bad f***ing start. Wait. Fuck. That's new. Anyway, and make sex strictly mean biological sex and thus be able to exclude trans women from whatever they like. They will not allow the word woman to be erased by health services and will amend the NHS constitution to do so. You mean the health services that you've had control over for the past 15 years and decided that only now is this an issue? They say they will ban conversion therapy, but they've been saying they would do that for a while now, and it still hasn't happened, so I wouldn't hold my breath. And, to finish, they are proudly waving around the fact that they passed the Same-Sex Marriage Act about 11 years ago, during which there have been 6 different governments. So, overall, pretty bad. The Labour Party is the other major political party in the United Kingdom. Originating in the Labour and Socialism movement wave in the early 20th century, they have had several prime ministers over the past 100 years and are the established Liberal Party in the UK. Much like the Conservatives, Labour is a broad, often dysfunctional, messy collection of groups across the political spectrum, ranging from traditional socialists and leftists to radical centrists to the dreaded neoliberals. The origin of the broad range of identities is quite easy to pinpoint. For the first 60 years of Labour's existence, they were a fairly traditional leftist party supporting the likes of trade unions, welfare and civil rights. However, in 1969, following years of a stagnating economy, industrial strikes, and a general difficulty in finding the UK's place in the post-imperial world, then Prime Minister James Callaghan faced a vote of no confidence in Parliament. He lost by 1 vote, and so a general election was called in which a certain Margaret Thatcher won. Over the next few elections, Labour couldn't make a dent in Thatcher's popularity, and even when she resigned and John Major took over, Labour still couldn't win. They needed to change, to alter their image. They needed a new Labour. Oh! Enter Tony Blair with this bold new strategy for Labour. It involved shrugging off and stripping away many of Labour's traditionalist ideals and moving away from its working class base, replacing them with neoliberal ones and shifting towards the middle. They weren't fighting the Conservatives on the matter of which ideology was better, they were fighting the Conservatives on who could do the Conservative ideology better. And you know what? It worked. Blair was really popular for a time. The war in Afghanistan and Iraq kind of put an end to that. And after Blair left office in 2007, Labour found itself in the same position as the Conservatives were in the early 2000s, with competing ideas and personalities trying to lead the party and find the formula that would keep them in power. Brown took over immediately after Blair and attempted to move away from Blairism and lost. Ed Miliband tried to softly move the party back towards the left in 2015 and lost. Corbyn tried to go further left in 2017 and 2019 and lost. And so Labour and Starmer busted out Old Reliable and decided to go back to Blairism. But more. In the past, and I emphasise in the past, Labour did do work to further queer rights, as well as introducing queer people into British politics. The first openly gay MP was a member of Labour. The first openly lesbian MP was a member of Labour. The most LGBT MPs to be part of a cabinet came during Tony Blair's first ministry. It was under Labour that various important LGBT legislation occurred. The Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which decriminalised homosexuality, was passed under the Labour government at the time. Under Labour government, Section 28 was repealed in 2000. The party introduced the Gender Recognition Act in 2004. And the Equality Act in 2010, which, among others, protects the rights against discrimination in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation. They are both fundamental parts of protecting and codifying queer rights into law. So, to break kayfabe for a moment, I originally started writing this video several months ago, because it takes time to make these things. And every time I try and write the section about the Labour Party, I have to keep rewriting it, because when I look at the news, someone in Labour has said something bad, or announced something that they had previously said, or even sometimes just done nothing instead of doing something. Starmer's Labour has proven rather two-faced on the topic of queer rights. Sure, he shows up at London Pride holding a big pride flag, saying that he supports queer people and listens to their struggles and concerns, but then he goes and does an interview on notorious transphobe Rat's Nest and Mumsnet. He visits several anti-queer religious organisations, reneges on previous statements, like agreeing that trans women are women. Now, I guess this could be some elaborate ploy to get queer rights into the government. Like, Starmer is actually pro-queer, but he can't just say that because he can't be sure you'll win in that case. So he's putting on a veil of anti-LGBT rhetoric and conservatism to get votes from conservatives, so that when he wins, the veil will drop, and he will go, "Fooled you! Estrogen for everybody!" That, or he's just putting on a veil of anti-LGBT rhetoric and conservatism to gain votes, and he doesn't care who gets caught underneath the bus from it, and maybe it isn't even a veil, and he's just a conservative dressed in red. During the row, when the Conservatives blocked the Scottish gender bill from passing into law, Labour boldly chose to do nothing.
I have no strong feelings one way or the other.
Didn't stand against the Tories, despite them being the opposition party, didn't vote with the Conservatives, despite them obviously having currents of transphobia in the party. Labour just sat back and did nothing. Starmer has also ruled that the Westminster Labour Party would start cracking the whip at the Scottish Labour Party's stance on similar LGBT issues, after Scottish Labour supported the SNP's Gender Recognition Reform Bill. Welsh Labour also appears to be in similar crosshairs. And it keeps getting worse. Things like making it a priority to ban trans women from women's hospital wards and making a separate ward for trans people. Two issues with that. One, it's discrimination. Two, you're not going to build new hospital wards, so I guess trans women just don't get to go to hospital. The Shadow Equalities Minister scrapping support for trans rights, saying that single-sex spaces are only for biological women. Removing a councillor candidate after they were found to be transphobic, then reinstating them 3 days later after they apologised for being transphobic, but not before they added that they were a proud gender critical on their Twitter bio. And then the Shadow Equalities Minister holding a meeting with the LGBT Alliance, a very transphobic think tank, and saying that it was productive. The baffling thing is that numerous polls and surveys show that Labour voters don't agree with the Labour Party's stance on queer rights, among other policies. This YouGov poll from 2023 shows that 75% of declared Labour voters support trans people. So Labour is just burning its base to be more like the Tories to capture this centre-right right-wing bloc. And Starmer himself has had weird inconsistencies on his stances of queer rights. During that spat with Sunak on the 7th of February, he rightfully calls out Sunak, and there is a sense that Starmer is upset here, that he's angry.
He's a man of integrity when he's got absolutely no responsibility. Absolute. Of all.
But that just raises more questions. He's either being insincere about being angry and is just doing this to try and curry favour, which makes him as bad as Sunak, arguably. If he is being sincere and is upset about how trans people are treated, why does the Labour Party keep saying stuff like this? Is Labour just trying to appeal to Tory voters because they're so desperate to get back in power? Does Starmer receive bad advice? Does he not even have control of the party he is the leader of? I don't know. And that's very worrying for any political party, let alone the party that is meant to be one of the strongest in the country. There are better people within Labour, people who support queer rights and queer people. The likes of Angela Rayner, Zara Sultana, Nadia Whitmore, and even former leader Ed Miliband have all voiced support for transgender and queer people. And sometimes they put a little bit more effort into it than just saying words. Earlier this year, Prime Minister of 47 days, I will never let that be forgotten, Liz Truss attempted to get through a bill that restricted trans women's access to areas such as bathrooms. Labour MPs decided to filibuster the motion, blocking it from being put to a vote by naming ferrets.
And just to put on record, my brother had a ferret called Oscar.
Well, she has that now on the record. I don't really know what else to say about that, except I'm sure it.
Perhaps Starmer's position on queer people will be cleared up in the Labour manifesto. They want to ban conversion therapy, so you're on the same level as the Conservatives. I am being facetious, banning conversion therapy is a good thing, so I'm not going to hold it against them. Labour wants to implement the caste review in full. Okay, so now we are 2 for 2 with the Conservatives, so come on Labour. They will modernise, simplify, reform, the gender recognition process. And how will you do that, Labour? Oh, you don't say. And it doesn't involve self-identification, and it still involves doctors and waiting lists. It feels like, once again, that Labour is trying to appeal to both queer people by offering bans on conversion therapy and gender recognition reform, but wanting to appear balanced by implementing the caste report and not specifying what their gender recognition reform is going to be, so that they can make it up later when the winds have changed. Overall, it's fairly weak. The perennial third wheel of British politics for the past 100 years, the Liberal Democrats try to occupy the centre ground, a creamy middle between the lows of Labour and the lower lows of the Conservative. They've technically only existed since the early 1990s, when the temporary alliance between the Liberal Party and the Social Democratic Party became a full-blown merger. For about 2 decades, they hovered around the periphery of the government, staying around 50 to 60 seats in Westminster, but being a consistent third place to Labour and the Tories. That was until 2010, when the Liberal Democrats were able to capitalise on Labour's decline after the financial crash, as well as luring away some voters from the Conservatives. They didn't actually gain more seats, but when neither the Conservatives nor Labour were able to get a majority, there was an opportunity. Enter stage right, or should that be stage centre? The Liberal Democrats, who would be the kingmakers of this election, the power to pick who would become the next government, and the Liberal Democrats would have to be part of it. So, well done, Liberal Democrats. You've managed to become large enough that you can enter the government. Now, we have 2 choices for you. We have the incumbent Labour Party, whom you share more of your policies with and who you are generally more aligned with. And there is also the Conservatives, but we know that you two don't get along. I can fix him. They did not. The Liberal Democrats were relegated to fairly low and unnotable positions in the cabinet. Sure, they got to be Deputy Prime Minister, but they also got the Minister of State for the Cabinet Office and various secondary secretary roles. The perception of them in government generally split into 2 camps. Labour voters, who had switched to the Liberal Democrats over the past few years, saw that they weren't able to moderate Conservative policies on topics such as the NHS and tuition fees. And Tory voters, who switched to the Liberal Democrats, saw that the Lib Dems were just sort of in the way of a full Conservative government. Their support crashed very quickly. In a matter of months, support for the Liberal Democrats halved from 20% to 10%, which they've been at pretty much ever since. And in 2015, they won just 8 seats, and haven't been able to get more than 15 in Westminster since 2010. On the topic of LGBT rights, they've generally been in favour of them, although their centrist nature means that they have had several issues over the past few years. Former leader Tim Farron, pictured here doing his best bird impression, is a prime example of this. He voted against a precursor to the Equality Act that would have stopped private companies from discriminating against queer people. He supported the same-sex marriage vote 4 times, kept dodging a question about whether he thought gay sex was a sin, then said he thought gay sex wasn't a sin, and then reneged and said that he regretted that statement. Current leader Ed Davey, by contrast, appears to be much better on the topic of queer rights, even if he hasn't got the hang of Photoshop yet. According to the website They Work For You, which keeps track of voting history and patterns of MPs, Davey has a very strong record of supporting all bills and motions that further LGBT rights. Although, under Davey's leadership, the Lib Dems did say that they reject all prejudice and discrimination, and then also saying that gender-critical viewpoints are allowed internally and that gender-critical opinions should be protected under law. Philip Lee, a Tory, defected to the Liberal Democrats in response to how Brexit was going. This led several members of the LGBT plus Liberal Democrats network, a queer equality group within the Lib Dems itself, resigning in protest of Lee joining. You may think that this was because Lee was against queer rights, and you would be right, but not in the way you would expect. Instead of voting against bills supporting LGBT rights, he instead just decided to abstain and not vote, which could very well be the most low-effort form of homophobia. Let's see what the Liberal Democrats have cooked up. They want to offer asylum to those seeking due to their gender identity or sexual orientation. LGBT asylum seekers make up about 5% of asylum applications, and the grant rate has increased year on year since 2017 to 72%. But there is a massive backlog on applications, so there are certainly LGBT asylum seekers in the waiting list that the Liberal Democrats want to give asylum to, which is an admirable goal. They will respect and defend rights of people of all genders and sexualities, including trans and non-binary people. It's a bit of a nothing statement, but okay, it's a voice of support. They will ban conversion therapy, par for the course. They want to reform the gender recognition process by removing the requirement for medical reports, recognize non-binary people in law, and the removal of the spousal veto. For those of you who don't know, if a person is married and wants to apply for a gender recognition certificate to legally change their gender, their partner needs to give approval. As you can imagine, this has problems, and I agree that getting rid of it is entirely correct. And there's a bonus section on promoting LGBT rights internationally, so I can't wait to see Ed Davey going to Saudi Arabia to pitch queer rights whilst playing polo or something. Overall, it's far better than the Conservatives or Labour. The Green Party has existed since the mid-90s, but they've only really picked up in the past 15 years, peaking in 2015 when they got 1 million votes in the general election. Unlike other Green parties in places like Germany, the Green Party of England and Wales, and that is an important distinction as you'll see later, has struggled to firmly establish itself in UK politics. The party currently has, and so far has ever had, 1 MP for Brighton Pavilion. However, since the last general election in 2019, the Greens have achieved some significant growth which could lead to a greater general election success this time. In local elections, the number of Green councillors has increased year after year, and in 2023, the party took control of its first council. The Green Party has historically been LGBT friendly, very LGBT friendly even. In their election manifestos in 2015 and 2017, they've included policies about training teachers in LGBT issues, improving same-sex marriage equality and adoption rights, to behind-the-scenes policies like simplifying pension claims for queer couples and widowers. They've created standalone manifestos looking at LGBTQIA+ topics, and they've often spoken about and supported overlooked groups within the queer community. They've included in their policies rights for intersex people, such as including it in the Equality Act, and protecting intersex minors from medical intervention until they are old enough to decide. And former leader Natalie Bennett has even publicly voiced support for polyamorous couples, a rarely touched area in politics. Now, I imagine that for people watching this video, this is probably one of the parties that many people are interested in. It has a progressive liberal perspective. It takes the issue of climate change seriously. It has a leadership policy that promotes gender inclusivity, and it's historically been the most LGBT-friendly party in the UK. What's not to like? In recent years, however, the party has been infiltrated by transphobes and gender criticals to the point where Sean Berry chose to step down as co-leader. One of the most prominent transphobes has been Shahara Ali, who, as well as being deputy leader for a time, has run to be leader several times now and never gotten more than 25%. So maybe he should take that as an indication to go away. In a completely unrelated piece of information, he was supported by Graham Lynham. Ali's case was settled in early 2024 when the court found that while his sacking wasn't procedurally correct, that the party can fire people whose views contravene the party's stance. Because, you know, parties can have policies and kick people out who don't follow those policies. The Green Party Women Group, a member group within the Green Party itself, was kicked out due to procedural failings. Much like Ali, the group is claiming that they were kicked out due to gender-critical views. This is extended to the party's representatives in government. Jenny Jones, a House of Lords member and target you would find in a Dishonored game, is a member of the Green Party, but gets upset by being called a TERF and doesn't support self-identification, despite that being the Green Party's official stance. These issues around transphobia have caused deeper divisions in the party itself and the Green movement in the UK to form. The Scottish Green Party has severed ties with the Green Party of England and Wales over the concerns of transphobia. This might have been for the better, since the Scottish Greens were actually in government in Holyrood, whilst the Greens still just have one seat in Westminster. The Scottish Greens were able to get into the Scottish government by forming an agreement with the SNP, a condition of which was pushing through the Gender Recognition Reform Bill I mentioned earlier, so up the Scottish Greens. The Green Party has a good track record for this kind of stuff, so expectations are high. The Greens manifesto wants to add self-identification for trans people, good start, remove the spousal veto, also good, and recognise non-binary and intersex people on passports by using the letter X, pretty good. They want to increase mental health support for the queer community. Depression rates in LGBT people can be over 150% compared to non-LGBT people. So, more funding is appreciated to support a group of people who are disproportionately affected by it. They want to maintain and improve queer content and resources in schools, so the opposite of what the Conservatives want, which we like. Overall, the Greens continue their strong history of having a very LGBT inclusive manifesto. To understand what the Reform Party is, and where it comes from, requires a quick history lesson in this man, Nigel Farage. Before he was shilling pyramid schemes on YouTube and wishing Big Chungus a happy birthday,
Big Chungus sends his regards.
Nigel Farage was a politician. He was most prominent as the leader of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party from the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s. UKIP was a right-wing populist party whose central, and to be honest, only policy was getting the UK out of the European Union. In 2015, UKIP peaked in the polls, receiving 13% of all votes cast. Although UKIP failed to win any seats, the Conservatives had noticed the rising tide of Euroscepticism over the past few decades, and the Tories included it in their election manifesto. When the Conservatives won and announced a referendum on EU membership, Farage obviously campaigned in favour of leaving. And, as I'm sure most of you remember, the year 2016 happened. Brexit won, and everything began to get significantly worse in the world. To celebrate this victory that Farage had literally campaigned for over 2 decades for, he decided to bravely run away from politics so he didn't have to deal with the aftermath of how, when, who, what any of this was going to mean. Flash forward to 2018. Brexit is still stuck in limbo, and Farage made his triumphant return to politics, forming the Brexit Party, a single-issue party determined to get Brexit done. Now, They didn't actually do anything. They just sort of sat around in the European Parliament being angry at the concept of the European Parliament until Boris Johnson passed a Brexit bill. So, now that Farage had achieved his lifelong dream for the second time, he went on a world tour, becoming the crowd warmer for politicians who actually became leaders of their countries, and selling gin. And as for the Brexit Party, it reformed into the Reform Party and has attempted to forge its own identity on the conservative side of politics to varying success. Take their logo, for example, where the only difference between Brexit and Reform is the removal of this small notch, which, to be honest, I don't know why it was there in the first place. The Reform Party are, much like Farage's UKIP, a right-wing populist party which campaigns on the basis of making the UK electoral and political system fairer, plus general conservatism thrown in there for good measure. This is the main focus and identity of the party, and unlike Change UK, who remembers them, the Reform Party has at least managed to stay around and achieve some form of notability and presence, to the point where they've become a nuisance for the Tories, especially since Reform UK got their first MP after Lee Anderson defected from the Conservatives to Reform UK. Whilst the party itself hasn't outlined any queer-specific policies, or to be honest, any policies that don't just extend beyond saying we'll fix everything and make Britain great again, based on their former MEPs in the European Parliament, we can infer that they don't mean to support queer people. I mean, look at all those red names in Shinigami eyes. Former Conservative MP and Reform Party member Anne Widdecombe has quite the rap sheet for voting against LGBT rights. Although she supported the decriminalisation of homosexuality, she had opposed every single bill supporting queer rights afterwards over her 4 years of being an MP, and making statements about how science could cure being gay in the future. In a run-up to many of the recent by-elections over the past few years, the direction most of the candidates took was a return to traditional conservatism, with some candidates saying that the modern Tory party is too woke, whatever that means. They aren't, or at least most of them aren't, as delusional as the American Republican Party, even if there were mentions that it was trying to cozy up with Ron DeSantis, although I can't imagine they're still doing that. They're instead closer to the European populist parties that are hard right, who often take far-right political views and policies, but believe in the principles of democracy, in the largest air quotes I can manage. Think of the VVD in the Netherlands, National Rally in France, and the Brothers of Italy in Romania. And that's the sort of group Reform is attempting to nestle in with. Fun fact, during the last general election in 2019, the then Brexit Party was the only significant party to not mention LGBT people. So, now that they've had 5 years to think about it, what does their new manifesto mention about queer rights? It does include sections on LGBT people, and they are all bad. In their manifesto, I'm not calling it a contract no matter how much you try reform. They want to ban transgender ideology from primary and secondary schools because we need to one-up the Conservatives, don't we? Reform wants to review the online safety bill so that social media giants that push baseless transgender ideology have no role in regulating free speech. You see, Reform UK love free speech so much that they want to police free speech. They want to mandate single-sex spaces everywhere because, once again, we need to be more conservative than the Conservatives. They want to remove the Equality Act. Okay, I know this video is the queer guide to the general election, but if there is anyone else out there watching, the Equality Act is really, really good. I like having protection against discrimination for various things, and I'm sure everyone in the population likes that because the Equality Act covers a very large part of the population. And anyone wanting to remove the Equality Act or change the Equality Act is bad. And therefore, Reform UK, not that I need to tell you this, is really, really, really bad. And now, over to Scotland, where the water tastes better, you can buy a deep-fried Mars bar, there are 2 football teams that matter, and where I have to explain more about the structure of UK politics. So, like everywhere in the UK, Scotland gets split into various constituencies that elect politicians that represent them in Westminster. Simple so far. The number of seats within Scotland changes as boundaries are redrawn, and currently just under 10% of total in Westminster. Scotland also has a devolved parliament, inventively called the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament is known as Holyrood after the area of Edinburgh it's located in, and I'll refer to it as Holyrood going forward just because it's easier. Holyrood has its own separate political cycle, where they elect their own members, called MSPs, using a mix of first-past-the-post and proportional representation. That's not being considered in this general election, but the parties that field in Scottish elections are still in general elections. Aside from that, the structure between Holyrood and Westminster is fairly similar. There is a leader, they have a cabinet, and the opposition forms a shadow cabinet. They have debates, it's all the same. Holyrood has local powers over areas such as tax, health and agriculture within Scotland, which is often why public services in Scotland can be much better than their English counterparts because they are independently curated. Westminster does have the ability to block Scottish bills from receiving royal assent, the so-called Section 35, if Westminster believes that the Scottish law would interfere with the implementation of general UK law. And if I had £1 for every time Section 35 was used, I would have £1, which isn't much, and it used to be worth a whole lot more before October 2022. The first of two parties exclusive to Scotland that I'm going to cover is the SNP, standing for the Scottish National Party, not the Scottish Nationalist Party, as has been the low-hanging fruit for political banter for years. They primarily campaign on the issue of Scottish independence, alongside generally liberal policies over areas Scotland has control over, such as the environment and healthcare. In the mid-2000s, they experienced a boom in popularity, taking control of Holyrood and dominating the Scottish seats in Westminster, making them currently the third largest party. And that's pretty much the whole story for the past 15 years or so. The most notable and relevant thing the SNP has done for queer rights is pushing through the Gender Recognition Reform Bill in 2022, which I brought up earlier, that would allow people to change their gender legally easier in Scotland. The bill is amongst the longest and most hotly debated in Holyrood's history and was passed by a supermajority of 66%. The bill was supported by the majority of the SNP, Scottish Labour, Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Greens, who would only enter into government with the SNP if the bill was pushed to completion after several years in the works. That doesn't mean everyone supported the bill. The Scottish Conservatives obviously didn't, but there was a part of the SNP that voted against the bill, a more socially conservative side. After Nicola Sturgeon resigned as First Minister in early 2023 for what she said at the time was for personal reasons, but in retrospect turned out to be a massive funding scandal, a new leader had to be found. The new leadership contest was primarily contested between Humza Yousaf and Kate Forbes, and also Ash Regan was there, I guess. The Gender Recognition Reform Bill was one of the main talking points between the candidates, with Regan and Forbes against the bill and Yousaf for the bill. Forbes' campaign was beset with numerous instances of anti-LGBT statements and rhetoric, including being anti-abortion and anti-same-sex marriage, and when asked about her party's vote on the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which she missed due to being on maternity leave, she said she wouldn't support it. She tried to pivot the position as an issue of faith, that her conservative Christian values precluded her from supporting such stances. She made this argument despite the fact that her main opponent is a practicing Muslim and defended the gender bill and same-sex marriage as civil rights within Scotland. To point out the hypocrisy of anti-trans people saying that trans people will somehow exploit the law and take control of the world, here's a little story. After Sturgeon resigned on the 15th of February, the leadership election was called, and if you were a member of the party on the 15th, you could vote. Simple, right? Well, some people left the party before the 15th because, they didn't like trans people and they didn't like the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. And therefore, they couldn't vote because they weren't members of the SNP on that date. Can you see where I'm going with this? SNP MP Joanna Cherry, who opposed the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, suggested that the rules around the date should be changed, pushing it later to allow people who had left the party and then rejoined when Sturgeon resigned to vote in the leadership election. Now, maybe I'm being cynical, but an MP who opposed the bill pushing for the rules around membership to be changed to allow people who opposed the bill to vote in a leadership contest for a candidate who opposed the bill might have some ulterior motives beyond just getting more people to vote. The SNP said, rather accurately, that this was a preposterous idea, and the leadership election went ahead as normal. Some of you may actually recognise the name Joanna Cherry, or at least recognise her face, because she is the woman who, in the halls of Westminster, held up the "Shut the fuck up" turf meme featuring Lily Hoshikawa from Zombieland Saga, a transgender character. This isn't important to the video, it's just quite funny that this actually happened in Parliament. In the leadership election itself, Yousaf was elected as leader of the SNP and so First Minister of Scotland, although the result was close, Yousaf eventually winning 52% versus 48% Forbes won in the final round. In the aftermath, Yousaf tried to keep the party on track, but there was a series of resignations and rebellions in the party since that have weakened the party's image significantly. Forbes moved to a backbencher position and tried to build up her own faction within the SNP with the goal of taking over should Yousaf not last. Ash Reagan has defected to the Alba party and is currently its only member in Holyrood. Yousaf's SNP implemented a new hate speech law in 2024, which makes the stirring up of hatred in regards to age, disability, religion, race, sexual orientation, transgender identity, or differences in sex characteristics punishable with a maximum of 7 years in prison. The law attracted complaints from the likes of J.K. Rowling and Elon Musk, so that's an absolute win. But Yousaf didn't last. After just a few months, he broke the power-sharing agreement with the Scottish Greens that he had inherited from Sturgeon's government. This split has been attributed to Yousaf's decision to scrap key climate change targets, but Yousaf was also considering temporarily halting the administering of puberty blockers to under 18 transgender people, neither change being something that the Scottish Greens could tolerate. He attempted to keep a minority government, but after a vote of no confidence seemed inevitable, he resigned. In his place, John Swinney has taken over the First Minister position. With an SNP that is seemingly falling apart over the concept of trans people existing, Sweeney has attempted to bridge the divide by appointing Kate Forbes, one of the anti-trans people from earlier, as the Deputy Prime Minister. The SNP's manifesto says that they want to protect the LGBT community, and if we're independent, we can make our own laws enhancing protection. The centre point of the SNP is gaining independence for Scotland, so filtering protecting the queer community through the perspective of independence isn't unusual per se, but I would rather you just come out and support queer people through other policies. But I'm sure they've got others as we go through the manifesto. Where's the rest of it? That's it? What about the Gender Recognition Reform Bill? The one supported by a supermajority of your party members and which you spent a year in court fighting the government over? You got nothing on that? You got nothing on anything else? I'm disappointed in you, SNP. I expected more from you. The scrappy due to the SNP's Scooby-Doo, Alba is the other party only in Scotland that I'm going to talk about, which, much like the SNP, campaigns for Scottish independence, but with a distinctly more conservative edge to it. Former SNP leader Alex Salmond has been the leader of the party since 2021, after he left the SNP. Alba has 2 seats in Westminster, Kenny McCaskill and Neil Hanvey, both of whom defected from the SNP, meaning Alba has failed to win any seats in any election. That's not just in Westminster, in the Scottish Parliament, where they have won 0 seats, and even on a local scale, where out of 1,200 potential seats in local governments, they have also won 0. It's like Britain at Eurovision. They have had a few defectors join them, so they do have some form of presence, even if pitifully small, because why win elections when you can just poach people from other parties? So, if they haven't won any elections so far, why are they in this video? I could be talking about the Women's Equality Party, or the Communist League. So why Alba? Firstly, they are in the UK Parliament, so that counts for something. Secondly, there is a notability to them as a sort of socially conservative right-wing option of Scottish independence that could theoretically appeal to people. And thirdly, and most significantly to this video, Alba and its candidates are a bit ludicrous when it talking about queer people. And not in the usual snake in the grass way of having concerns and wanting to value everybody's opinions. It's more in a sort of delusional way that's usually reserved for American politics. In fact, it's been noted by some observers that the entire reason for Alba's existence is derived from the concern that the SNP's support for trans identification would pose a risk to women's rights, which, I hasten to add, it doesn't. Members of the party have promoted various harmful and sometimes conspiratorial theories about LGBT people. One candidate in particular, Margaret Lynch, at a women's rights conference, suggested that LGBT people wanted to lower the age of consent to 10 years old, and that the recognition of trans people would allow for sexual predators. And I really should emphasize this. Neither of these are true and are completely delusional. Keep in mind that the leader of the Alba party, Alex Salmond, was in 2019 arrested on 13 counts of misconduct, and before I get sued and sent to the British equivalent of the gulags, otherwise known as Milton Keynes, I should say he was found not guilty on all accounts. That first part about lowering the age of consent to 10 years old was shared on Twitter by Neil Havney, one of Alba's MPs in Westminster, who is also an openly gay man. And I don't know how he can be so stupid to support a party and statements from people in a party that obviously don't like him. Havney himself has also had a personal, hatred. Yes, hatred for transgender people. He was against the Gender Recognition Reform Bill that the SNP introduced. His Twitter feed is just a relentless torrent of transphobia. He's openly met with sexmatters.org, who are a pressure group that campaigns against the very existence of transgender people, and most recently in a Westminster debate on conversion therapy, Havney made very specific and very deliberate reference to L, G, and B people, and not T people, as in transgender people. It's a very low effort, uncreative method of being transphobic, but it is quite something to try and say that in Parliament. And he was, rightfully, chewed out by Tory MP Alicia Kearns. And if the Tories are calling you out on transphobia, that should tell you something. When Alba was asked about whether blatantly homophobic and queerphobic statements that one of their candidates said was a reflection of the party itself, Alba refused to answer, which perhaps isn't surprising given the information I've just gone through, and their manifestos continues on that trend. Alba was the last party to release their manifesto of the parties in this video, so they must have been working on something good. Also, this is section number 4 of their manifesto, so they're evidently quite proud of it. They want to support the caste review, which is kind of standard policy at this point, but still sucks. They recognise the Equality Act, but want to enhance sex protection, because sex is a biological fact. Alba, evidently, wants to pick a fight with the Reform Party over who is more bigoted. They oppose the SNP's Gender Recognition Reform Bill, and based on the SNP's manifesto, it seems like they don't support it as well. Alba are worried about the risks to women. Yeah, we all hear those dog whistles, Alba. We know you don't like trans people. Sex-based rights on all levels, they're really attaching them to the self that they want to exclude trans people from everything. And they will fight to say, without hesitation, that a woman is a... Have you been talking to Joanna at all, Alba? I'm just curious. Time to go over to Wales now, and the political structure there. Don't worry, it is in general very similar to Scotland. Wales is split into various constituencies for Westminster, and it also has a devolved government that has powers over local topics called the Senedd. It's Welsh for Senate, in case you couldn't guess. Wales has 32 seats in Westminster, which have mostly been picked up by Welsh Labour throughout its history. Plaid Cymru, Plaid Cymru. Plaid Cymru are a Welsh national party that campaigns for Welsh nationalism and representation as well as generally left-wing policies. They are also committed to achieving Welsh independence and have strong links to the SNP. Whilst not as politically prominent as the SNP is in Scotland, Plaid Cymru have been around Westminster for the past 50 years. They hold 3 seats in Westminster, which technically makes them the 6th largest overall, and they are the 3rd largest in the Senate, and have previously been part of the Welsh Government when they formed a cooperation agreement with Labour in 2019. Admittedly, of all the parties I've put into this video, Plaid Cymru are the smallest and are arguably the least influential overall, but in Wales they are the largest alternative to Labour and the Conservatives, which is valuable information if you live there. As part of that coalition agreement I highlighted earlier, Plaid Cymru pushed for what is called the LGBTQ Action Plan. The Action Plan was an overarching attempt to bring Welsh queer services and LGBT services up to par with the rest of Britain. This involved banning conversion therapy, providing trans guidance for schools, and would begin to speak with Westminster about trying to implement recognition for non-binary people on documents such as passports and driving licenses, or at least attempting to start a discussion about it, which the Tories promptly shut down. Former leader Adam Price was also the first, and so far only, openly gay person to be the leader of a political party in the UK which has managed to win seats in Westminster. But, in something that I'm sure isn't surprising now, there are transphobic factions within Plaid Cymru. Some of you may be familiar with the name Owen Hurcomb, the former mayor of Bangor, a small town in the north of Wales, who became the world's first non-binary city official leader. They did have plans on running for the Senate with Plaid Cymru, but stood down citing transphobia in the party. They're now living their best life, fixing a boat and studying for a PhD in Newcastle. I'm very happy for them. One of the most prominent things that you find when you search Plaid Cymru and LGBT is an advert they ran in 2015 that was perceived as not good. The setup for the advert is quite simple. It focuses on people announcing that they are voting for Plaid Cymru in various different situations. The first vignette is a young man is coming down to meet his parents and is going to have a serious conversation with them. The obvious setup being that they are going to come out to their parents. But the swerve is they're coming out to say that they're voting for Plaid, not that they are gay.
What a twist!
Parties don't turn me on. I've pretended to be Labour to try and fit in, but...
And, yeah, it's not good. It's not even just the initial swerve. The advert is using language and is setting up a situation that is specifically written about how it feels to come out. It's playing off an event that, for a lot of people, is very difficult to do and is trivializing something that can be traumatic. Are you going to be the little party that pushes for queer rights, Plaid? Turns out, yes. Plaid wants to promote LGBTQ inclusion in sport, which is positive. Historically, gay athletes haven't felt like they've been able to come out in professional sports, and the transgender inclusion in sports debate can be described as a dumpster fire with rocket fuel poured over it. So it's very positive to see that Plaid wants to support queer inclusion in sports. They want to address health inequalities, including those by gender. It doesn't specify queer people specifically, but considering their other policies, I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that they will do something for LGBT people. They have noted an increase in hate crimes and want the police force to take a stronger stance on it. Well, it's nice that you're acknowledging a problem, but I wouldn't necessarily trust the police to deal with this. Plaid wants to do outreach to local communities, such as small pride events and conventions, which is good. I think a lot of parties like to focus on the big events, like in London and Manchester, and smaller events, particularly in places like Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, are often overlooked by such parties. End conversion therapy, standard, to be honest. They want to keep improving the Wales Gender Identity Clinic so people don't have to travel all the way to London, and yeah, that's good. Not having everything centralized in one location is good. And they want to seek the powers to introduce trans self-identification as a bill to the Senate. I highly doubt Westminster will give you that right, but it's the thought that counts, Plaid. It is important to understand that Welsh and Scottish branches of the main UK political parties can have different views on politics, sometimes significantly different. So it's important to weigh up the regional and national policies of parties and individuals. I've already mentioned that the Scottish Greens and the Green Party of England and Wales severed ties over transphobia concerns, but other parties have distanced themselves from their Westminster counterparts to varying amounts. Welsh Labour, for example, has in the past adopted and maintained more progressive policies than the Labour Party in Westminster has, including on the matters of queer subjects, such as putting forward action plans to make changing gender easier, establishing Wales's first gender identity service, and even showing support to an often overlooked part of the queer community, raising asexual and aromantic flags outside various government buildings. The regional Conservatives generally fall in line with Westminster, but sometimes they are slightly less bad. Still pretty bad. Next is Northern Ireland, which is complicated. To summarise briefly, following the Easter Rising in 1916, in which the Republic of Ireland gained independence, the UK retained Northern Ireland to act as a place for Unionists to live in, separate from the newly created Irish Republic. In the late 1960s, a period known as the Troubles began, where violence began to flare up in Northern Ireland between Unionist paramilitaries who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom and Republican paramilitaries who supported Irish unification. Going into the 1990s, the Good Friday Agreement was signed between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. The agreement, among other things, gave Northern Ireland its own assembly, creatively called the Northern Ireland Assembly, which uses a political method to create a mandatory coalition between parties based on how many seats they win. The largest Unionist party, the DUP, and the largest Republican party, Sinn Féin, usually take the majority of cabinet positions. The idea being that both sides should be able to govern together to help Northern Ireland achieve peace by working together. Emphasis on should. The divided nature of the two sides mean that government shutdowns are possible whenever one side wants to protest something, such as when the DUP walked out of the government formation to protest Brexit laws, which left Northern Ireland without a government for over 2 years. Why aren't I talking about how Labour, the Tories, the Liberal Democrats act in Northern Ireland? Well, because none of them actually run for office there. Except for the Tories, and based on their vote share, I'm not sure it's going too well for them. Most other parties have an affiliation-based system, where there is a local party in Northern Ireland which is aligned with a larger party but isn't an official branch and is independent, such as the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland and the Liberal Democrat Party in the UK. On top of all this, Northern Ireland gets 18 seats reserved for it in Westminster. In general, Northern Ireland has been slower than the rest of the UK in improving LGBT rights. It was the last place to allow for same-sex marriage. It is the only place in the UK where the Equality Act has limitations in its effect, and it was the last place in the UK that kept a ban on gay men donating blood. Due to the nature of Northern Irish politics being somewhat disconnected from Westminster and the rest of the UK, and with the number of different political parties that are exclusive to Northern Ireland, I can't cover all of them, or even most of them. I mean, look at this chart. I'm instead going to focus on the two most commonly prominent ones, that being the Democratic Unionist Party, or DUP, and Sinn Féin. There are more parties, and Northern Ireland is a more politically competitive place than other areas of the UK. However, to try and keep this video accessible, and to not get bogged down in explaining the difference between the DUP, UUP, PUP, and TUV, I'm just going to stick with the DUP and Sinn Féin. Also, the Northern Ireland Assembly is kind of known as Stormont, and I'm going to call it Stormont from now on. The DUP, or the Democratic Unionist Party, are the leading unionist party in Northern Ireland. They've historically been the leaders of the Northern Ireland Assembly for the past few decades, and was briefly, kinda, sorta, maybe involved in the Westminster government from 2017 to 2019 via a supply and confidence arrangement with the Conservatives. The DUP didn't have any cabinet positions, but would give the Conservatives a majority by voting with them in bills, in exchange for Northern Ireland receiving extra funding. It was a bit of a mess, and no one was happy with the arrangement except the DUP, who got a rather disproportionate amount of power. The arrangement ended in 2019 when the Conservatives simply didn't need them anymore because they won a majority. Historically, the party has been very much against LGBT rights, overwhelmingly pushed by party founder and long-term leader Ian Paisley. Paisley was an aggressive evangelist, preaching against the sins of homosexuality, denouncing it as a crime against God and man, and its practice is a terrible step towards the total demoralization of any country. And this anti-LGBT rhetoric leached into party policy for decades to come, long after Paisley stood down and eventually died, and it's something that the party continues to have to this day. DUP members and candidates have in the past said things like homosexuality being disgusting and vile, and that if homosexuality became a criminal offence again, then it would be expected that people follow the law. No, they wouldn't. Also, why would you say that unless you didn't think you had a chance, or at least wanted to make that happen? Because it implies that you have some sort of goal to make homosexuality illegal again, and then set the expectation that everyone would just go along and accept it, which I can assure you, they would not. The DUP have also blocked bills supporting same-sex marriage, done by using or abusing a method called the Petition of Concern, which turns bills from requiring a simple majority installment to pass to instead requiring a cross-party vote to pass. Since the DUP is socially conservative, along with most other unionist parties, they can simply vote against the bill, meaning that it doesn't satisfy the condition of having unionist support, even if a majority of the Assembly votes in favour of the bill. These issues around LGBT rights proved somewhat of a stumbling block when trying to establish its supply and confidence agreement with the Tories. Several politicians in Labour and the Liberal Democrats pointed out the DUP's poor historical record on LGBT rights, and even some Tories did. Then Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson called out the DUP. Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, had to give assurances to her own party that it wouldn't compromise LGBT rights, for whatever that's worth, by entering into an agreement with the DUP, saying that LGBT rights in Northern Ireland wouldn't be backpedaled. In recent years, the DUP has made some attempts to soften its stance, calling previous statements absolutely atrocious. Former leader Jeffrey Donaldson met the Rainbow Project, an LGBT charity based in Northern Ireland, in 2021, and in 2022, DUP members attended the Pink News Belfast summer reception alongside other Northern Irish parties. But there is still a fundamental anti-queer rhetoric in the party. In 2021, during a motion to ban gay conversion therapy, the DUP attempted to amend the bill by allowing it in regards to preaching, prayer and pastoral support. In 2011, the party maintained a permanent ban on gay men donating blood after the UK revised the ban to a one-year deferral system. Eventually, in 2016, the new Sinn Féin health minister brought the regulations consistent with the rest of the UK, despite the fact that the DUP was the First Minister. Westminster election manifestos from Northern Irish parties are less significant than parties that only campaign in other regions of the UK, simply because Northern Ireland has less seats compared to Scotland or Wales. By contrast, Stormont election manifestos are much more developed and detailed and are traditionally what we see when a general election is called. I will still go over the manifestos for this election that the DUP and Sinn Féin have published, but it won't take very long for two very different reasons. The DUP's manifesto makes no mention of equality, no mention of gender, no mention of LGBT, no mention of anything. Perhaps they were paying for their manifesto printing by the word. Sinn Féin, and yes, I do know how to say this one, are the current leading Republican Party in Northern Ireland, having taken over the handle from the SDLP a few years ago. Sinn Féin contests elections in both the UK via Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland itself, on the primary points of Irish unification. In 2019, Sinn Féin became the largest party in the Northern Irish Assembly, the first time a Republican Party has ever done that. Leader Michelle O'Neill has gone on to become First Minister, but only after several years of government shutdown after the DUP walked out of the Assembly to protest Brexit laws in Northern Ireland. Here's something that might help you at a pub quiz. In 1916, Constance Markievicz became the first woman to be elected to the UK House of Commons, and was a member of Sinn Féin, although she didn't take her seat in Dublin West for 2 reasons. 1, she was in prison, and 2, it was Sinn Féin policy at the time not to take any seats in Westminster, due to the policy of abstentionism, as they were fighting for Irish independence at the time. The policy of abstention continues to this day, so there are always a few seats free in the House of Commons, although apparently not enough for everyone to sit down. Similar to the DUP, Sinn Féin hasn't historically supported queer rights. They have slowly changed their stance and become one of the most queer-friendly parties in Northern Ireland, and also the Republic of Ireland too, although they still aren't great. This is something that Michelle O'Neill has spoken about, that much more needs to be done for LGBT rights in Northern Ireland. She tried to form a show of unity with the DUP, saying that they should come together to help advance queer rights. It was a low-pressure way of trying to get the DUP to form a government, although I don't think they can be tempted with queer rights. If you Google Sinn Féin LGBT, the first result goes to their website, which talks very specifically about lesbian, gay, and bisexual equality, and just doesn't mention transgender people. The document itself looks quite out of date, just in terms of its production style, but there's no published date on the website or the document itself, and the fact that it's the first thing that pops up when you search for this isn't a great look. They have released more recent policies in their manifestos and such, highlighting all LGBT people, and the policies they've included are much stronger than the DUP. Members of the party still have said homophobic things. One of their Irish Parliament members, Brian Stanley, made a tweet, because it's always a tweet, isn't it? And I know Twitter has a character limit, but I counted, and he had so many characters left to use. He did not need to start using numbers instead of words. The Sinn Féin manifesto is 7 pages long, so, as you can imagine, it doesn't go into a lot of detail. We want a society that values and celebrates the diversity of our identities, religious or non, sexual orientation, gender, disability, age, or ethnic origin. We oppose homophobia. We want a society that is inclusive of everybody. It's a nice collection of non-committal statements. So those are the 10 parties I've decided, with my ultimate authority, that deserve being looked at. Now, obviously, this is a quick overview of the party's general stance on LGBT issues. Individual candidates and members can and do have more or less extreme opinions, and you should look into your local candidates by using websites such as whocanivotefor.co.uk. This is more important now as the election boundaries have been redrawn, meaning that several MPs, including some high-profile ones, are shopping around and going to be fielding in new seats. And it's at this point I think we should have a moment of silence for the constituencies that won't be with us this election. You can also find out how your current MP has voted on various legislation on theyworkforyou.co.uk in case they're running for re-election again. And yes, it is somewhat depressing to see laws being approved after as few as 11 people showed up to do their jobs. So who should I vote for? That's the question you've been asking yourself for 45 minutes, and I finally managed to get to it. Should I vote for the party that I most agree with? Should I vote for the party that is least bad and has a reasonable chance of winning? Should I vote for an MP who supports me, but who is a member of a party that ultimately doesn't? It's a difficult question for me, a collection of PNGs on the internet, to answer for you. It's something I can't do, and also don't want to do. Morally, you should be able to draw your own conclusions and evaluate your own beliefs to vote for the person you think is best. Cynically, who the best person is dependent on where you are and who is likely to win. Not to mention that some of these parties won't field candidates where you live. If you live here, you can vote for these parties. Here, you can vote for them's parties. Here, those parties. And here, them's parties. Individual constituencies themselves can be a two-horse race between different parties, so tactical voting is something you almost have to engage with. And keep in mind that every party is going to have wildly different goals, priorities, and powers. The nature of the SNP and Plaid Cymru means they can only represent their respective regions in Westminster. I realise it's probable that one of you out there has been blessed with youth and hasn't voted in an election before. And I cannot stress this enough, do it. Just do it. No, wait, I can't say that, or I'll get sued. Please do it? Yeah, that'll work. Please do it. It's really important to vote, to make your voice heard, and to participate and understand how the country works and what is happening in it. And people may make the usual arguments, I'm just one person, I can't make a difference, it doesn't matter anyway. Wrong. You want to know what the narrowest election victory in modern history was? 2. 2 people in it. So remember, there are no excuses for not voting, unless you're the king, under 18, or in prison, in which case, you can't vote, sorry. As of the posting of this video, you should have received this, a poll card. It essentially tells you when to vote, between 7 AM and 10 PM, and where to vote, a specific personal location for you to go vote at. It could be a school, a church, a library, a pub, a hairdresser's, a car. If you don't have your poll card, it doesn't matter. You're still able to vote, and if anyone tells you that you need to bring it, they're probably trying to intimidate you. This will also be the first general election that will require photo ID to vote in, so bring something with your name and face on it. There's a link in the description that has all the valid forms of ID on it, because, surprise, some forms of ID aren't valid to be used, whilst near identical ID is allowed for no discernible or reasonable reason. There's also a link to a website that can help with ID for transgender voters. Now, when you get to a polling station, you'll be given a little piece of paper with the list of candidates on it. Step into the little booth, tick the box next to the candidate you like the most, or hate the least, stick it in the yellow box, and congratulations, you voted. Now, go home and stare at your computer for the next 18 hours, constantly refreshing the webpage, waiting for any piece of information, going mad as you watch a map slowly fill up with different colours until you fall asleep from exhaustion and wake up bleary-eyed to see the country has somehow gotten worse than it previously was. And the whole political circus starts again. And that's it. That's the video. What a journey we've been on. Going through the UK's political history, its most prominent political parties, how to vote, and how much it sucks to live here. This video took a long time to research, script, make, and I don't want all that going to waste because otherwise the voices will start again. So please give it a like, favourite, subscribe, send it to your friends, send it to your enemies, all those things YouTubers tell you to do. I'm going to lie down now and have a drink, or 10. Stay fresh, everyone, and wake me up when this all blows over.